Jeden z nejvýznamnějších britských novinářů a také šéf Free Speech Union, organizace, která ochraňuje svobodu slova ve Velké Británii. Toby Young. Mr. Young, welcome to our show.
Thank you.
To be frank, we never thought about Great Britain as a country that would need a free speech union. So what happened with free speech in UK?
Yeah, well, it's not in particularly good health. Even though we have a conservative government, free speech protections in law have gradually been eroded, and there's an enormous amount of social pressure now to conform with orthodox opinion across a range of areas. I guess.
Can you just tell me what are these orthodox opinions?
Yes. So during the pandemic, it became very difficult for people to criticize the lockdown policy. Mm-hmm. They would get into trouble if they worked in the medical profession. They might lose their jobs. They'd be reprimanded if they worked in the public sector. Journalists with critical points of view about the lockdown couldn't get their work published, or they were censured by the media regulator. When the COVID vaccines were rolled out, any criticism of the COVID vaccines was taboo, verboten. I mean, you wouldn't be put in prison, but you would suffer social ostracization and possibly lose your job. Any criticism of the Ukrainian side in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, that's taboo. Any challenge to the prevailing consensus amongst climate scientists, if you challenge the idea that we're in the midst of a climate emergency and we need to reduce carbon emissions urgently to save the planet, you can't criticize that hypothesis. So there's a range of areas, a cluster of subjects on which there isn't much freedom of thought, and any dissent is punished in one way or another, not usually by the courts or by the state, but socially. Your topic, your posts will be removed from social media, people will complain about you in the workplace, and so forth. So that's created a kind of conformity of opinion and a great deal of self-censorship. So a recent poll published at the beginning of this week, carried out by an advisor to the Prime Minister, discovered that 76% of the British public are censoring themselves for fear of the consequences that might follow from saying what they really think about these controversial areas.
So again, this is not like a totalitarian state that will put you in the prison, but you can lose your job, or what other sorts of ostracization that might be? I mean, lose your job is pretty clear, but what are the other sanctions you face?
Well, we often hear from university students that if they express conservative opinions, if they dissent from trans orthodoxy, if they say they believe in the biological reality of sex, or if they challenge the climate change consensus, they lose a lot of their friends. There'll be a kind of mass condemnation of them on Facebook or Twitter. Complaints will be submitted to their departments or to the university. In some cases, they can be physically assaulted by activist students who are furious that they challenge woke orthodoxy. We looked after one student at Durham University, for instance. He defended Israel's right to exist. This wasn't in the recent conflict. This was about 4 years ago. And because he'd stood up for Israel and said that he was a conservative and also challenged Britain's mass immigration policy, he was physically assaulted in the dining room of his college by some left-wing activist students. And he had to leave that college and go to another college. I mean, he suffered a great deal, and that's not that uncommon. So those are the kinds of penalties you have to pay now for being a dissident.
The guy that attacked him physically was not prosecuted?
No, he wasn't. No. But it isn't just these social sanctions. So a recent development, Scotland is about to pass the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Act. which is going to criminalise vast swathes of speech which are currently lawful. And there's a big question about whether J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter books, will end up being taken in by the police in Edinburgh and questioned under caution because she has misgendered a trans activist on X. That is to say, she's referred to this trans woman, but who is a biological male, as him. And it's not clear, but that could be a hate crime under this new Scottish law. And it won't just be writers who are monitored by the Scottish police, it'll also be comedians. So if you make an offensive joke that people with protected characteristics, a member of the LGBT community or a person of colour, if they object to the joke, they can complain to Police Scotland. And Police Scotland have created these anonymous reporting centres. One of them is in a sex shop in Glasgow, believe it or not, where people can report hate crimes anonymously, snitch.
Write it on a piece of paper, put it in the box.
Exactly. Reminiscent of Czechoslovakia in the 1960s and 70s. But it's extraordinary now that telling jokes, off-colour jokes, offensive jokes, could become a crime in Scotland. It's as though the Scottish police read The Joke by Milan Kundera and instead of seeing it as a work of satirical fiction, decided it was a training manual and decided to go after people who joke about the wrong thing.
But, you know, we all grew up on British sitcoms. We grew up on Monty Python's, on Rowan Atkinson. Very critical, very satirical, very, very dark humor very often. So does it mean that, let's say, Monty Python will not be possible in today's Great Britain, not talking about Scotland?
Yeah, John Cleese, who's become a free speech warrior, says that there's no way Monty Python would be commissioned today. And the BBC, even though it has all the episodes of Fawlty Towers on its library, it's begun to censor some of them for inappropriate language. And I think it's even removed one of the episodes because it's considered now too offensive. So yeah, British sitcoms of yesteryear are great and we all love them, but you couldn't get them made today.
If I remember it well, Rowan Atkinson was also campaigning for free speech. Can you remind maybe our listeners what was it about? It was a few years ago.
Yeah, it was a few years ago. It was, I think, a change to the Public Order Act, which would have made it a criminal offence to use insulting language. And there was an example of a young man who had asked a police officer, I think, if his horse was gay. And the police officer arrested him for hate speech under this new law. And eventually that campaign was successful and that new law was scrapped. But since then, things have got much, much worse.
But what is the driving force behind this? Because, you know, you have the Conservative government for quite a long time, since 2008, if I remember it correctly. The Conservatives are presenting themselves as, free speech supporters. So is this pressure coming like from the government, from the bureaucracy, or is it, let's say, down from the grassroots level?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it seems to be the product of what feels like a new religion driven by social media. So it's really only gone mainstream since about 2013, 2014, when everyone got smartphones. And it's via social media, via Facebook and Twitter, that this new religion has spread. It started in America, it spread to the United Kingdom and other English-speaking countries, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, and it's now beginning to spread to Europe. Elon Musk calls it the woke mind virus, and it doesn't It seems to capture professionals, the professional elite. Believing in these new religious precepts is a kind of a way of signifying your membership of the Brahmin class, the elite class. So it affects university graduates, academics, senior members of the media, politicians in all parties. They all seem to be gripped by this kind of great awakening, this new religious movement. And one of the shibboleths of this new movement is that free speech is dangerous, that it can be offensive, it can upset people, it makes them feel unsafe, it silences the voices of the historically disadvantaged and the marginalized. They're too afraid to speak up if heterosexual white men are kind of hogging the platform and being too noisy. So it's all part of this kind of, it presents itself as being compassionate and all about social justice and remedying the injustices of the past, like slavery and the patriarchy and homophobia. But even though it puts on this nice mask, behind the mask, it's very authoritarian, very draconian, and quite reminiscent of the communist control systems in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe, but not yet official.
Is it not actually in Great Britain, with the exception of Scotland, that the government is at least somehow trying to defend free speech against these grassroots movements of, student organizations and social media mob and so on?
Well, our successive conservative governments have paid lip service to free speech, but have done very little to defend it. The one exception is last year, the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act was passed, which will strengthen protections for free speech and academic freedom on university campuses, but just in England, nowhere else in the United Kingdom. But in all other respects, things have got a lot worse in the last 14 years since we've had Conservative prime ministers. I'll give you one example. In 2014, a new arm's-length body was created called the College of Policing, which dictates policy for the police in England and Wales. And they created this concept called non-crime hate incidents. So if you're accused of a hate crime and the police conclude you haven't committed a hate crime, they'll record it as a non-crime hate incident. That is, they'll put in their databases the fact that you've been found guilty of committing a non-crime.
So you didn't do anything.
You didn't do anything.
Anyway, you are in some sort of database.
But you're in a database, and if you apply for a job as a teacher or a carer, and you're asked to do an enhanced criminal records check, this can show up on your criminal record. A non-crime can show up on your criminal record. And we calculate that about 250,000 non-crime hate incidents have been recorded in the 10 years since this guidance was published. In England and Wales alone, that's an average of about 65 a day. And meanwhile, burglaries, auto theft, vandalism are going completely uninvestigated by the police. In the whole of England and Wales, in the last 3 years, no burglaries were solved in more than half the neighbourhoods in England and Wales. So the police are so busy policing our tweets, they have no time to police our streets. I mean, we have this situation now in the UK we call anarcho-tyranny, which will be familiar to those who can remember what it was like to live in a communist society in the Czech Republic, whereby the law-abiding, the non-criminals are harassed and harried by the police and the authorities, and criminals are allowed to go about their work unmolested. It's a sort of incompetent type of authoritarianism. We're ruled by authoritarian mediocrities.
Can you give us some examples of what the hate speech is, especially what the people are mentioning in the social medias, and then the police is knocking on their doors that they said something or wrote something on Twitter or Facebook? Yeah.
So our most recent victory, which we won yesterday, a deputy chairman of the Conservative Party called Rachel McLean, so quite a senior political figure, an elected representative. A few months ago, she ridiculed the Green Party candidate in her district, who was a man who identifies as a woman, and posted a picture of himself on Twitter wearing a blonde wig. And Rachel McLean said something vaguely dismissive, saying that the people of Bromsgrove would be able to tell who is and isn't a man, and putting on a blonde wig isn't going to make any difference. But it wasn't particularly impolite. But the Green Party candidate complained to the police. The police concluded that no crime had been committed, but recorded it as a non-crime hate incident. And it's taken us 3 months, but we've now managed to get that non-crime hate incident removed, struck from the record. But that's an example. Another recent victory was a civil servant who worked in the Department for Work and Pensions, she complained about a recruitment event for the Metropolitan Police, Britain's largest police service in London. They were having a recruitment event in Portsmouth, but only women, members of the LGBT community, and people of colour were invited to this event. If you were a white heterosexual male, you couldn't come. And she was looking after lots of long-term unemployed white working class men, and she complained that they were excluded from this recruitment fair. And because she complained, she was dismissed for gross misconduct. And we took on that case and took the Department for Work and Pensions to court, and eventually they settled out of court and paid her £100,000 in compensation.
So can you say that at the end, if you have the time, energy, and the money to struggle to go to the courts and so on, that at the end you usually win these cases?
We quite often win. We've taken on, since 2020, when the Free Speech Union was set up, we've taken on over 2,300 cases. And we've calculated that where they've come to a conclusion, we've won something like 74% of the time. And often that's because the courts are still obliged to observe the law. The law hasn't caught up with the culture. The law is downstream from culture. So even though the woke mind virus has infected all our institutions, museums, galleries, universities, the upper echelons of politics, the BBC, the mainstream media, the courts have, to a great extent, remained immune from this particular virus because the law hasn't yet been changed to make all these new dogmas legally enforceable. It is being changed in Scotland. It comes into force on April 1st, April Fool's Day, coincidentally. But for the most part, the law is on the side of free speech. So if you threaten to take the would-be censors to court, you can often win. And actually, they often operate like bullies. You know, they rely on intimidation and bullying in order to get their way, in order to shut people up, in order to silence their critics. So if you stand up to them, if you stand up to the bullies, often they'll back down or go and pick on somebody else.
Well, I can imagine that, one thing is if you are, deputy chairman of Conservative Party. Other thing is if you are some,
Yes.
average person that just wrote something on Twitter and suddenly he is a subject of a mob. I can imagine it's pretty hard.
Yes, it's pretty hard. And when people talk about cancel culture in the UK, not just in the UK, but often the kind of the defenders of the status quo will say, what cancel culture? People have been rude about J.K. Rowling. She's been called a transphobe and a bigot, yet she still can publish her books. She's still one of the richest people in Britain. She hasn't been cancelled. You're just bleating about nothing. You're a snowflake. But actually, as you say, for ordinary people, without the resources of J.K. Rowling, it's much, much more difficult to survive these efforts to cancel you. And most of our members, we have now almost 13,000 members at the Free Speech Union, they're ordinary people, bus drivers, dinner ladies, nurses, who are being targeted by censorious mobs because, according to them, they've said the wrong thing.
But still, we can say that the woke mob still consists only a minority of the UK's population. how it that they are so successful? How it that the majority didn't stand against them?
Well, I think you have to look to the success of various communist regimes to understand how a small minority of dedicated political activists and apparatchiks can enforce an ideology which the vast majority of people don't agree with. I mean, it's partly because those who don't agree with the prevailing orthodoxy are terrified to speak up. They remain silent for fear of the repercussions if they speak their minds. And because so few people speak up, no one realizes that the people who disagree, the dissenters, are actually in the vast majority. And I think the same thing was true of most communist-controlled Eastern and Central European countries before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Once the Berlin Wall collapsed, it became clear that almost no one believed in the kind of prevailing communist ideology. But until that moment, it wasn't common knowledge that there were so many people who didn't believe it. I think Václav Havel has the story about the shopkeeper paying lip service to communist dogma because he didn't realize that nobody else did. He thought that everyone else did, and he had to kind of display his conformity in order to kind of survive as a shopkeeper. It's similar. It's a kind of the tyranny of the minority over the majority by not letting anyone know just how unpopular and their views are.
What's the solution? Because you can either struggle over the control of various institutions, universities, medias, and so on, or you can do what some dissidents did, form some sort of internal ghetto. The parallel polis was the term in communist Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
But that also means that you isolate those two groups even further. Mm-hmm.
Well, we do see the emergence of a kind of counter-revolutionary dissident movement in Great Britain. And the Free Speech Union, probably one of the leaders of that kind of anti-woke coalition. And, we don't exactly meet in secret in basements, in London, but it's almost like that. But people are talking about the creation of parallel institutions. So in America, the University of Austin, Texas, has been created as an alternative to other universities where there is real freedom of thought and freedom of expression. I think the way to combat this is to create institutions which can provide people with the protections from all the forces massing around them to try and silence them. And it's not just the Free Speech Union. There are a bunch of other organizations, free speech organizations springing up. And there are also branches now of the Free Speech Union in other parts of the world. There's one in New Zealand, one in Australia, one in South Africa. We're hoping to get one set up in Canada. So there is, I think, across the world, a kind of free speech movement that's getting organized and fighting back. But, we're vastly outnumbered. And we have nothing like the resources of all the people we're up against.
You are, let's say, mainly ideologically conservative, I guess. Are you getting also support from people on the left because, especially in the past, there were quite a few people on the left who were also supporting free speech?
Yes. I think the people try and caricature free speech as a far-right cause. And it's certainly true that many on the left have abandoned free speech because they're now in charge. They get to say what is and isn't acceptable speech, so they don't have to defend free speech anymore because it's no longer in their interests to defend it because they're not the oppressed minority who people are trying to silence anymore. They're in charge. They're the bosses. But there are still principled people on the left who will defend free speech, and particularly the non-woke left, the old-fashioned left. Lots of Marxists, curiously, in England are pro-free speech. And if you look at our case files, last year, the largest single category was sex and gender. So 40% of the people we went to bat for were feminists expressing their belief in the biological reality of sex, who then get targeted by trans rights activists. And for the most part, they are left-wing. They're old-fashioned, second-wave feminists who are, have discovered that they can no longer defend sex-based women's rights in the public square, or at least it's very difficult to do that without suffering some repercussions. So all the time we are going to bat for left-wing feminist women who've got into trouble by running afoul of trans rights orthodoxy.
Mr. Young, I thank you for your time and I wish you good luck in your fight.
Thank you, Matthias.